Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon. My guest today is Dr. Curt Fields. He has been a lifelong student of the American Civil War, and his interest in portraying Ulysses S. Grant was driven by his study of the war and the subsequent respect and admiration for General Grant. He is the same height and body style as Grant and is one of the most convincing and realistic interpreters of Grant in the entire country. Dr. Fields has portrayed Ulysses S. Grant at numerous battle reenactments and other events across the entire country. He was also chosen to portray General Grant at the 150th anniversary of Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox Court House. And that will be our topic of discussion today, as Dr. Fields will portray General Grant once again during our conversation today about the end of the American Civil War. We are very pleased to have the nation's leading Ulysses S. Grant interpreter with us today. Welcome, General Grant.
Thank you very much. It's good to be able to join you this day and talk about all manner of things about the war and how we are conducting it.
General, it is tradition here to accompany the discussion with a special brew. Today we have Lucky 25 American Brown from the Trapezium Brewing Company of Petersburg, Virginia. This beer is dark and roasted, and Trapezium brews American Brown to be smooth with notes of coffee, caramel, and a chocolatey finish. Lucky 25 also won the 2018 Beer Army Beer Wars Gold Medal and is currently available to go in crowlers and growlers at the Trapezium Brewing Company's taproom. Remember, the best way to enjoy an episode is with one of our featured brews. I would also like to ask you to subscribe to the podcast. Simply click on the subscribe button on the directory that you use and get new material immediately after it is published. Subscribing, it's the only way to get those new episodes right away. And to the ever-expanding list of supporters and listeners from 60 countries and hundreds of cities across the United States, I have to say, as always, thank you. And now, I raise my Lucky 25 American Brown very high. And to General Ulysses S. Grant, General-in-Chief of the U.S. Army and the recipient of the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia from General Lee, I say cheers. You actually started the war in Illinois and you made your way to Missouri. You spent the majority of the war what would be considered the Western Theater, but now you're in the Eastern Theater, and it comes with new challenges. Not that you didn't have challenges in the Western Theater, but what were the differences between some of the challenges you experienced out West and what you are now, or what you had experienced in the East?
Rob, the primary difference initially was the deeply interior structure of leadership that I had to come to know in the Eastern Theater. I've been fighting for 3 years in the Western Theater. I knew all of my commanding officers all the way down to the regimental level. I knew who could do what and what they did best and whom to assign to specific tasks or requirements. I did not have any of that knowledge of the leadership in the Army of the Potomac. In fact, I had made it clear to Sherman in February of 64 that even if I should get the nomination and the approval, and I would say the House and the Senate did not unanimously approve the resurrection of the rank of Lieutenant General, even though my name in the Senate was not specifically mentioned, but I was the only one. I'm the original short list in Washington City. That term's come up, and I am the original short list person. I was the only name on the list. And it wasn't unanimous in either of the two houses. But I had told Sherman that if I should get that, I was not, emphatically, not going to have my headquarters in the Eastern Theater, that I should have my headquarters in either Nashville or perhaps Louisville, but I would stay in the Western Theater. And that takes me back to what I initially said about command structure and my not knowing who could do what. Because when I got to Washington City, Mr. Lincoln made me a believer that he wanted me personally in command of the forces going against Lee. I told Sherman when I saw the circus that was Washington that I felt a lesser man would knuckle under to trading politicians and not do what actually needed to be done. And President Lincoln, the night that we met, March the 8th of 64 in the Executive Mansion, in private, the president told me, when you make the acceptance speech, General, I want you to specifically address the activities and efforts and successes of the Army of the Potomac and of their leadership. And let's see if we can't assuage any hurt feelings and praise them, because I don't want them to be resentful of you. But I knew they would be. The attitude that I encountered was, all right, Grant, if you're so good, why don't you come over here and show us how it's done? We've been fighting Bobby Lee for 3 years, and you're going to come in here and show us how to do it? Well, why don't you come on over and show us? And it was pretty much that attitude. In fact, Pete Longstreet told me an incident where one of the officers on the staff there came in and said, well, I understand they've appointed Grant, but we're going to whip him just like we have everybody else that's come at us. Longstreet said he advised him that I know Grant, and I will tell you that we had better husband our resources and put every musket in the hands of every man that we can put on the steps and in the march, because that man, as you so derisively refer to him, is going to fight us every minute of every hour of every day until this war is over. I know Grant. So Meade, to go back to the other side of the issue, I understand George Meade, whom I think a great deal of, had written to his wife a letter shortly after I got command and said, well, Grant is now the General-in-Chief. Let's see how he does here in the Eastern Theater, because I will tell you that Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia is not Simon Buckner or John C. Pemberton and the Army of Mississippi. So he's got an entirely different foe to oppose. And I had to get in to that theater and quickly as possible, meet all of the leaders that were going to be under my command. And it was akin to Hercules cleaning out the Aegean stables in Greek mythology. So the first problem I had was to learn my command staff and who had what strengths, could do what in the best possible manner. And then I had Robert E. Lee. I hope that answers your initial question.
That does. That's great. I appreciate that. And that campaign that I'd like to speak about is Petersburg. And you realize the defenses at Petersburg, the soldiers were pretty entrenched, and you decided to take a different tactic and move the army south, and you had to cross the James River. I'm wondering how difficult was that river crossing, but how instrumental was it in closing out the war sooner?
Well, I'll quote Dick Ewell, to start my reply to that. Ewell was captured on April the 6th at the Battle of Sailor's Creek, when Lee was in quick retreat, falling back from Petersburg. He'd evacuated on April 2nd. Sheridan caught up with him at Sailor's Creek, captured 7,700 of his men, full 25% of his army that he had with him, and 9 generals were captured that day. One of them was Lee's own son, Custis. And it was the worst defeat that the Army of Northern Virginia suffered during the war. And Ewell had told Dr. Smith, don't recall his first name, but Smith told me on the night of April the 7th, the next night after Ewell had been captured at Sailor's Creek, he said Ewell was his cousin and that they had talked. And Ewell said, we knew after you fellows crossed the James that it was over and that we should negotiate for peace while we still had something to negotiate with. And anybody killed after we went south of the James is nothing less than murder, and someone should be held accountable. And let me go back to the front end of the issue of the question. When I crossed the Rapidan on April 4th, midnight, April 4th, going into April 5th of 64, I took 125,000 men across the Rapidan over 7 different bridges, 5 of them pontoon bridges. And we were going after Lee. Now, I want to emphasize Richmond was never my objective. Richmond has very little military value. Yes, they've got the Tredegar Iron Works. Obviously, that is of value to the Confederacy, but overall, essentially, Richmond had little value militarily. Its greatest value would have been the moral value. My objective was to pin Lee. Yes, if I could defeat him and destroy him, absolutely. But short of destroying the Army of Northern Virginia, to keep him pinned in Virginia and not able to get south to Joe Johnston, whom Sherman was in hot pursuit and trying to bring to bay after he's come up through the Atlanta campaign, through the march to the sea, and then through the Carolinas. My greatest fear of the war in that year, that 11 months that we were in siege or semi-siege, because Petersburg wasn't really a siege in the true sense of the word, but I'll address that in a moment. My greatest fear was that I was going to wake up in the morning or be awakened during the night and told that Lee had escaped, had stolen the march on me, and got south to join with Joe Johnston. But when we crossed that Rapidan, I was intending to engage Lee. Now, I hoped to get through the wilderness, that 70 square miles of a green hell, as the troopers call it, second growth, neglected farmland, now timber. The sun doesn't shine through most of it. And I really didn't think, and I gave a great deal of thought, that Lee would hit me in the wilderness, because I had 125,000 men. He had about 65,000. But he had, of course, being Lee, the extremely capable military leader and man and genius that he is, he viewed the question opposite of how I did and felt the wilderness would be an ally. And I think that it proved to be so. And he hits me in the wilderness, and the fight was on. And we boiled and fought and scrapped and boiled across Virginia for the next 44 days, I believe it was, until June the 3rd, Cold Harbor, which was one of the 2 decisions I made in the war that I regret. But that's for another time when we may visit and pass the time of day. But essentially, the Overland Campaign was over after Cold Harbor. And I'd had enough bloodshed. I'd had enough of assaulting Lee in fixed positions, because at Cold Harbor, and indeed through much of the Petersburg campaign, he was fighting and using the same entrenchments that he had developed and built 2 years earlier when McClellan tried his Peninsula campaign. And I thought, I can't hit him head on. It's just too bloody. And I had a strong sense that my troops would not, that I'd have a mutiny on my hands if I tried to get them to assault across those fields against those entrenched positions that Lee had. And I went back across the river and I did what I had become known for. I began to sidle and I began to hook arc southeast around Lee. Now keep in mind, Lee is tethered to Richmond. If I were to opine, and I rarely do, but if I were to opine, I would tell you that one of the, if not the most serious error that Jefferson Davis committed, if not the most, one of the most serious errors he made in his strategy was to keep Lee tethered to Richmond. Lee had to maintain a shield between me and Richmond. And everywhere I went, he had to race to get in front of me between myself and Richmond. If Lee'd been free to cut loose and go where he wished, he would have been a much different animal to deal with. If he'd had the mobility and opportunity to use that mobility where and how he saw fit, he would have been able to do substantially different moves than what he did. But that's a matter of conjecture. And conjecture is a parlor game that is played by adults who have absolutely no stake in that which they are talking about. That is conjecture. That's why I don't deal with it much. But I do in this case to emphasize Lee had to stay with me. I knew that between him and Richmond around Petersburg. Now, why is Petersburg important? I have people frequently ask me, well, General, why did you go after Petersburg? What was the criticality of Petersburg? Well, Petersburg had 5 railroads that came into it. That's the criticality of Petersburg. There were 5 railroads that came to a nexus in Petersburg, which is just a few miles south of Richmond. And they were running as far south as Tupelo, Mississippi, which was the breadbasket of the Western Theater. You always hear about the Shenandoah Valley being the Confederacy's breadbasket. It was. But there was another substantial breadbasket, the plains of Mississippi, central Mississippi. And they were still getting foodstuffs up to Lee coming into Petersburg. That was his connection with the Atlantic Ocean. And so he's getting blockade runner supplies still. Now, that was quickly cut off. But he's getting blockade runner supplies initially. He's getting supplies, food from the south, as far south as Mississippi and out of Texas, that they could get across the river. Not a lot of it, since we've taken Vicksburg. And it's akin to the human heart. You've got about 5 major arteries that run into your heart. And when you start blocking those arteries, you start having potentially fatal problems. And when I could cut off all 5 of those arteries, I would kill Lee. That was my point. Rather than hit Lee head on, I kept sidling to the southeast. I kept going around and stretching around and around because I knew he did not have the manpower to oppose me, and sooner or later, that string was going to snap. I crossed the Rapidan in May of 64 with 125,000 men. Lee had 60,000. At the end of that campaign, the Overland Campaign, 40 Days in Hell, as I hear my soldiers refer to it, because of reinforcements, we both, the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia, had about very close to the same number of troops we started that campaign with, which is astonishing when one thinks of it, because there were 100,000 casualties in 44 days. It's the bloodiest campaign in American military history. Lee, though, had lost men he could not replace. The men I lost, I could replace. And I was applying that pressure to stretching him to the point where either I could make a dart in and get him by the throat, or I would stretch him beyond his capability to defend. And make no mistake, Lee is, if not the best, I don't know who is a better military leader in our history. And he is a man to be reckoned with. Only a fool would not. And he was able to marshal his resources and use the advantages of being on the defensive with interior lines. He didn't have to go as far to get where he needed to get to stay in front of it. He was in a friendly region with a population that was friendly to him and kept him advised of my every movement. So he was able to keep up a strong, good fight. And I harken back to Shiloh when I made the comment after Shiloh that I was most impressed with the fighting capability of the Confederate soldier. He hurled himself at our positions at Shiloh, particularly on the first day and the second day as well, with no apparent concern for his own well-being. And he is a foe to be reckoned with, which is not to do anything but give him his just due, and it is not to detract from his opponent, the Federal soldier. It only adds glory to what the Federal soldier was able to do because he ultimately defeated the Confederate soldier. But I'm dealing and juggling with these conditions, and I keep sidling south and southeast. Now, my men, to give you an anecdotal example, don't think about my hearing everything that goes on in camp. And all of the rumors and the talk, it all comes under my tent flap. I hear it all. They call me the old man. I'm 43. They like to say that Ulysses Grant would flank the devil out of hell if he wanted to. And I have to take my cigar out of my mouth and kind of rub my mouth a little bit and hide a smile when I hear that. And sometimes I think they like to get close to me and say that just to watch my reaction. But that was my strategy. And just like an arc is described in the mathematical problem, I kept stretching south and southeast until I completely encircled Lee. We had 35 miles of trenches by the time we finally breached Lee on April the 2nd. 35 miles. 125,000 of us, and Lee evacuated Petersburg with about 50,000. 7 days later that he got to Appomattox, he actually had at Appomattox Court House about 12,000 men. But he had maintained his numbers pretty well throughout that year, and I just kept applying steady pressure. And ultimately, he broke. And let me go back and emphasize something that I said earlier to make a point upon a point. I enjoy doing that, about not knowing my command staff and not knowing Lee and his command staff and the young soldier that Pete Longstreet told me about and had come in the tent and sneering about Grant's got the position, and Longstreet had asked him, do you know him? And the fellow said, no, I haven't had the pleasure. I don't know that man. And Longstreet he dressed him down pretty well and said, I know him. And he'll fight us every minute of every hour of every day till the war's over. Pete was right, because from May the 5th of 1864 to April the 9th of 1865, there were only 4 days that there was not direct combat between the two armies. 4 days. The rest of that 11 months, we were fighting and scrapping every day. And that was driven by two fundamental issues, certainly positions you could take when looking at it. I meant to engage Lee and fight him until I beat him. And Lee was determined to stay alive and prolong the war until the North should get tired of it and press to sue for peace and have a negotiated settlement rather than a military resolution of the problem. The president felt, and I felt strongly, there must be a military solution to this matter because there have been too many lives lost and too much blood shed for everyone to throw their hands up and say, well, all right, let's just all go home and stop the fighting. No, sir. No, sir. There had to be resolution. And President Lincoln knew that I would engage Lee and keep him engaged until I defeated him because President Lincoln had gone through a litany of leaders before he selected me to be the General-in-Chief. And I want to emphasize, too, that I was not at any time the commander of the Army of the Potomac. This is an easily forgiven faux pas on the part of people. Most folks think that I was in command of the Army. I was not. I was General-in-Chief, and I was commanding 5 armies. I was commanding the Army of the James with Spoon's Butler. He hates it when I call him that. Spoon's Butler from the Army of the James in Virginia through Sherman in the Western Theater down to Nathaniel Banks in Texas and Louisiana. Franz Sigel to start out with there in the Shenandoah. So I'm commanding more than 500,000 men, but I'm traveling with the Army of the Potomac because President Lincoln made it very clear he wanted me with the Army of the Potomac. And I told George Meade I was impressed with him in that when I met him, he gave me a letter of resignation. And he said, I believe that you will want this because I think you're going to want to appoint someone of your choosing to command the Army of the Potomac. I was taken aback that George did that. And my estimation of General Meade rose significantly. And he also said, I expect you'll want somebody, perhaps Sherman, to come here and command the Army of the Potomac. And I said, well, essentially, I said, no, George. I pushed his hand back in his letter back and said, no, George, I want you to remain in command of the Army of the Potomac. If I wanted somebody else in command of the Army of the Potomac, he'd already be here. It's your army. You whipped Lee at Gettysburg. You've earned the right to command your army. I will not interfere with that. The president wants me to be in the field, and I need to be relatively close to you. My headquarters, except in circumstances where it is impossible to do so, will be a distance from your headquarters and out of sight. I don't want any confusion with information, messages, and dispatches, etc., coming to me first instead of you. I'm not commanding your army. I'm an overall command. The only time I will issue an order that does not go through you will be in contingencies where I must act quickly, and I can't wait. The situation does not permit that I should run through you first, but I will not infringe upon your authority. So I remember, many people don't, but I remember after Shiloh when General Halleck came down on April the 11th of 62 and assumed command in the field. It was only the second time in his career he'd ever been commanding in the field. And he did not relieve me of command, but he relieved me of command. He rearranged my army, restructured it. He even sent directives out to my army commanders, division commanders, to send their after-action reports, not through me, but directly to him, General Halleck, which, by the way, led to Shiloh was the only battle in the war where one of the commanding generals did not write an after-action report. I never wrote an after-action report for the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing, Shiloh. And I did not because of what I just told you, that General Halleck, I have since come to find out in a snub to me, actually told my officers, do not send through Grant, send your reports to me. So when General Halleck was called to Washington City to become General-in-Chief, he instructed me to write an after-action report. And I said, I will not. Now, this very nearly gave General Halleck apoplexy, and he demanded to know why not, such insubordination. And I reminded him, you told all of my officers not to send me, but you, their after-action reports. I cannot, and I will not write a report based on information that I never was allowed to see. And General Halleck, now they don't call him old brains for nothing. Halleck, who'd already been his fingers burnt a bit in trying to court-martial me after Fort Donelson, and the president stopped that. Halleck knew that if he charged me with insubordination, that all of this matter would come out, and that the president and Secretary of War Stanton would be very unhappy with him a second time with the same man over the same type of action. So General Halleck let that go. So, as I said, the Battle of Shiloh is the only battle in the war where one of the two commanding generals never wrote an after-action report, and that is why. In the field with the Army of the Potomac, that was the basis of why I was so careful not to tread on George Meade's coattails, because I knew how it felt. I knew how it felt to be in command, but you're not really in command because the commander, General-in-Chief, is on the field. And that worked fairly well. Of course, toward the end of the siege at Petersburg, the last few months, we had pretty much coalesced into one command unit, and I did, though not intentionally, become essentially the commander of the Army of the Potomac. But I always deferred to George Meade. So that loops back to my concerns about when I first took the command, about not knowing with whom I am dealing, who can do what, and their capabilities. During the Battle of the Wilderness, give you a good example. I don't recall the man's name, the general's name, but the second day of the Wilderness, I had gone to Meade's headquarters, and the battle is raging all around us. And a general comes in and was raising 2 fields of cane. He was loud and profane and obviously extremely disturbed, exercised, and gave General Meade a bad time. Meade gave him orders and he departed. And I was indignant. And I asked General Meade, who was that man? You should have him dismissed for insubordination. I would not tolerate such behavior and demeanor from an officer toward me. And General Meade did something he never did before or after. He walked over to me and began to straighten out my lapels on my coat and tug my buttons and straighten me out. I'd become a little disheveled. And very soothingly said, all the time he's straightening me out, oh, he's just disturbed. He's angry, and he's like that. He'll be okay. He meant nothing by it, General. And that was the end of the matter. And I have reflected many times since then about the leadership issue. You see, I didn't know who that general was. And he's one of the key figures in the Army of the Potomac. He was. And I didn't know who he was. I didn't know what he was capable of doing. I could see that he was exercised over something that had occurred in the combat, and he was disturbed, and I didn't care at all for his demeanor toward General Meade. Well, it turns out he and General Meade were longtime old friends. He was a very capable officer. Meade knew him, and I did not. And even that early in the campaign, but yet that far into my command as General-in-Chief, I didn't know my command staff as well as I should, and I had a big chaw to chew. President Lincoln had sent a laundry list of officers across the river commanding the AOP, Army of the Potomac, and they'd all mentally been mauled, gone back across the Potomac or the Rapidan, and rested, refitted, and sallied forth again at some time in the future and just repeat the process. Well, Lincoln knew I was not going to do that. I was not going to come back across the Rapidan. In fact, my reporting of my casualties in the wilderness, I underestimated the numbers that I sent back. Secretary of War Stanton put me to task for that. He said, you've reported your casualties as moderate, but we've got wagons of wounded and dying rolling into Washington City around the clock. What do you consider moderate? And I told him, well, perhaps I underestimated the numbers as I sent them back. And Stanton angrily demanded, well, why did you do that? And I said, because I knew you called me back, and I wasn't going to do that. I was not going to turn back. And I heard no more of the matter from the secretary, although I doubt he forgot it. But Lincoln did not want me to come back. He wanted victory. And the only way he'd been an amateur historian, in fact, and I'm only quoting him, an amateur military man, and I'm only quoting the president here. He told me, I've meddled in the armies too much. I don't want to meddle with you. I want you to do what you feel like you need to do. In fact, I don't even want you to tell me what you're doing, because I talk to newspapers all the time, and I might blab what you're doing. I had to laugh at the president of the United States telling his general-in-chief, don't tell me what you're going to do, because I might blab it. I liked his sentiment, and I really enjoyed the way he expressed himself. I pulled back across the river away the James, away from Lee, rather than go at him head on, and I began to sidle and probe and punch and poke and try to find a weakness, and never really expecting to find one. But if I did, to take full and swift advantage of a weakness that I might find. Absent that, to stretch him until he could no longer resist me, and then to overwhelm him. We were not innovative. We marched and fought and stretched and pulled and sidled for 11 months until we finally stretched Lee beyond the breaking point, and he had to evacuate Petersburg and therefore Richmond.
I have a few questions, General Grant. One is in reference to the Commander-in-Chief. You mentioned you were General-in-Chief, but the Commander-in-Chief actually visited you towards the end of the war. He was able, because of that visit, to go and walk through the streets of Richmond. You encouraged him to actually visit some black soldiers. Can you tell me about those few interactions that you had with Lincoln towards the end of the war, his visit with the black soldiers, and his walk through Richmond?
I regret to say, and given his assassination, I grieve to say that I did not spend much time with President Lincoln. I want to point out that Julia is responsible for the president having visited me at City Point. She had come to me on March, I believe, the 14th or 15th, and said, you should invite President Lincoln to come down here to City Point. I barely looked up from my paperwork there at my desk in the cabin there at City Point and said that the president may go where he chooses. She looks at me and taps on the desk to get my attention, and as Julia was wont to do, and she looks at me in that stern look, and she said, you need to invite President Lincoln here to City Point. And I looked at her and I said, President Lincoln is the commander-in-chief of these armies. He may go where he pleases, when he pleases. I don't have to invite him to come down here. And I don't purport to assume the effrontery to invite the president to come down here. And Julia said, invite the president. Contact him and ask him to come. I knew that I would have to, for her to drop the matter. And I said, all right, he won't come. I have no belief whatever that he'll come, but I will invite him. And so she smiled and left. Well, I invited him on the 15th. In an hour, he responded, and if it's possible to read enthusiasm and excitement through the words of a telegram, he was loud and long about it. Yes, he replied immediately. We'll be down there, and I'm bringing Tad, I believe it was, and his wife, Mrs. Lincoln, and some few folks, and they got on a boat. Within 24 hours, he was there. I was astonished. And when he got there, I was waiting for him, of course, on the bank there at City Point, which had become the 8th largest city in Virginia. The supply depot at City Point was completely created within weeks, and it was, I believe, it was either the 6th or the 8th largest city in the state of Virginia. But the president caught my hand and was just effervescent. He was beyond exuberant. He was effervescent. He invited me into, and Julia was with me to his cabin with Mrs. Lincoln there on the River Queen. And he said, General Grant, I want you to know I am eternally grateful for your invitation, particularly so because not one general, and he kept a straight, I can't, but he kept a straight face when he said it. Not one general has ever invited me to the field to visit their headquarters, but yet you have. The ladies went to do what ladies do, and he and I talked in earnest for some hours. He expressed a desire to meet with Admiral Porter, and I contacted Sherman. Sherman came up and was there for one day only, came in and spent the day with us, and we had the meeting. There's been talk of it being painted, my painting made of it. I don't know. I'll have to see if that ever happens. We met, the four of us, and talked for several hours about the war and what to do. Primarily, we talked about the peace because we made it clear to the president that it can't last much longer, and there's no doubt about the outcome. By mid-March of 1965, there was no doubt about the outcome. And I remember that President Lincoln said, when I asked him, how do you want to handle this? And he told me two things. Because I had told him on March the 1st that General Lee had reached out to me through the lines via Pete Longstreet and some people on my side wanting to meet with me personally and talk about a resolution of the matter. And I, of course, forwarded that to the president. The president came back and very sternly said, you will not meet with General Lee or any other military person in the Confederacy for any reason other than a military cessation of fighting. Do I make myself clear? Of course, I replied to you abundantly. He reiterated that on the River Queen. He said there will be no peaceful resolution. This is going to have to be a military ending to this. And when you get the rebels to lay down their arms, you will step back, General, and I will take it from there. I will handle the surrender and its aftermath. Then he said, let them up easy. And that is the dominant thought with me as we were in pursuit of Lee. I believe it was April the 2nd that I met President Lincoln in Petersburg. Lee evacuated. It was about 9 o'clock in the morning when I got into Petersburg. It was almost deserted because the Army of the Potomac was in fast pursuit of Lee. I invited the president, contacted him, and he came and met me at, I think it was Thomas Wallace's house, I believe, an attorney who lived there in Petersburg. Actually, a longtime friend of the president, but he was not there. The president and I met, had a relatively short conversation. I was anxious to leave. I told him, I've got to be with the Army. I've got to go. It was the last time I ever saw him. We talked, and he reminded me, he said, when you catch up with Lee, let him up easy, General. I don't want any more rancor than has to be, already is. Let them up easy. I want these men back home and in the fields and working, and let's bring this country together. And I said, yes, sir. Got on Jeff Davis and left. And it was the last time I saw the president. He went into Richmond, actually rather unexpectedly. He found out that day Richmond had been evacuated. He had a escort, I think some 25 sailors and Marines, and would not hear of it except that he would go into Richmond. And there was great concern of him going into Richmond so soon, but he did. He had visited the USCT soldiers and was praising of them. I was praising of them. I had my doubts, as did everybody. We all wondered what are they going to do? You're talking about people who have been enslaved and have had no control over their own lives, and then putting guns in their hands and telling them to be soldiers. Well, they quickly dispelled any concerns that I had and that anybody had. Once they were able to get into combat, they demonstrated that they were more than capable soldiers. And I have always felt that of all the people fighting in the Union Army, formerly enslaved men, now United States soldiers, were the ones who had the most to fight for. They were the ones that could look over their shoulders, so to speak, and see themselves in slavery, and now months, and in many cases only weeks after they have been freed, that they are in a uniform of a United States soldier carrying a musket. So they fought ardently, and they distinguished themselves. They acquitted themselves very well. I'm very happy with their valor and their combat performance. And the president felt the same.
So the last thing I would like to ask you is about that final surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox, and that day juxtaposed yourself with General Lee. You, of course, been writing and trying to corner Lee, surround Lee for all those days in a row. I don't believe your uniform had even caught up to you at that point. So you approached that meeting in a very different manner, two very different men. But can you talk about that final meeting and the surrender at Appomattox of the Army of Northern Virginia?
Yes, I can, because it's a matter that I very much like to address. My appearance. I have been severely criticized for being described, well, I've been described as slovenly in appearance, and I take umbrage at that particular term, but I was past mud spattered. I was virtually covered with mud, and I was filthy. I was that way because now, let me back up just a bit. We've been on the march in pursuit of Lee, almost at a trot, to keep up with Lee falling back west across Virginia. I saw something I had never seen before as a soldier. Of the more than 100,000 federal soldiers in pursuit of Lee, we were like a blue flood spilling across the Virginia countryside, through fields, into creeks, ravines, rivers, around buildings. It was just a blue flood going across the country to catch Lee. And there was not one straggler. And I had never seen that. There was not one man on the side of a road with his brogans off, rubbing his feet, or going into a field to get something to eat, or climbing a tree for fruit, or napping. Not one instance of that did I see. And that was almost eerie. I'd never seen that when an army was on the move. But with this army, with this purpose and this situation, there were no stragglers, no shirkers. Nobody wanted to be the last man killed, but everybody knew this was the end, and they wanted to be there. We left on the 2nd. My army was given 7 days cooked rations. Now, let's go to the night of April the 5th, when Sheridan, I was traveling with the Army of the Potomac, and Sheridan, who's got some 12,000 cavalry and is working around south and northwest around Lee to get in front of him. And some of the Army of the James and Griffin's 6th Corps and Ord's Army, now in command of the Army of the James. But Sheridan sent me a note late in 7 o'clock or so in the evening of April the 5th and said, I really wish you were here with me for this. Well, that's all it took. Meade is having some severe stomach problems, and he's a bed. In fact, he's traveling in an ambulance. He can't sit his horse. We have some concerns about whether he's going to be carried off. And I left immediately with a small escort of some 12 men. And we risked it to travel at night. It was a full moon, moonlit night, and I got to Sheridan's headquarters at about 10:30 p.m. on the night of April the 5th. At that point, I had left my van that had all of my personal belongings in it. I haven't had time to get much sleep
since the night of March the 1st, because I met with the president mid-morning of the 2nd. I left the president, got on Jeff Davis, and took off westerly with the Army. So I haven't stopped moving for 3 days now by the time that I met the night of the 5th with Sheridan. I haven't bathed. I haven't even changed my uniform. I've been in the saddle or next to it trying to get some sleep and back in the saddle. I left my van behind when I got with Sheridan because I was moving too fast at that time. Go through the 6th, the 7th, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on the 7th, I sent General Lee my first note, the first of 9 that we exchanged in less than 48 hours. And Lee was brought to bay the morning of the 9th. Now, I had moved, and this is key as well. I had left Curtsville, Virginia, the morning of the 9th. I had a blinding, killing migraine headache. I had gotten on Cincinnati. I switched to him because I wanted a faster, more powerful horse. I thought I might need that strength and stamina because I knew things were coming to a rapid denouement here. I didn't expect to meet Lee. I didn't expect him to surrender so soon. I was wearing no spurs. I had no hat cords on my hat, my slouch hat that I always wear. I was wearing what I always wear when I'm with the Army, a private's blouse, not an officer's blouse as I am pictured in so many paintings and pictures. Not one of those pictures or paintings is accurate. Not one. I was wearing my dark blue trousers tucked in my knee-high boots, no spurs. Private's 4-button sack, not an officer's 5-button sack, not an officer's frock coat. I had no sword, nor a sword belt. I haven't worn a sword since Shiloh, with the exception of the night we crossed the Rapidan back May the 4th and 5th. I wore one then, and that was the last time I had a sword on. I don't wear a sword. They bruise my leg and they bother the horse. And my slouch hat with no hat cord. I haven't changed clothes in 7 days. I haven't bathed in 7 days. It's been raining off and on heavily for the week. Virginia is ankle deep to knee deep in mud. Now, we had left that morning Curtsville on the Farmville-Richmond Road, which goes northerly into Richmond, main thoroughfare. We encountered some Confederate activity. Again, I've got an escort, 12 men or so, and we had to move over to our left to go northwesterly on the Farmville-Lynchburg Road, which leads into Appomattox Court House. When I made that move, the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James and Sheridan did not know specifically where I was. I wasn't lost to the Army. They just didn't know my specific whereabouts. When Lee went out to surrender to meet me at 10 o'clock on the morning of the night to surrender, he thought I was going to meet him from an earlier message he had sent me. I had responded. He got it, said, I'm not going to meet you, and so forth. That too, is another story about the messages we sent back and forth. But Lee had decided he had to surrender. And he was going to surrender to me. He wrote a surrender note and sent it through the lines with federal couriers through Meade's lines going back to the east. After a few minutes, he became concerned. He said, we need to have a cessation of fighting. And General Meade said, I don't have that authority. I've got orders to attack you at 1 o'clock this afternoon. Now it's getting close to 10 o'clock in the morning, 10:30. And Meade said, I can't stop this. So why don't you send another note through Sheridan's lines to the west? Maybe they could find him. And so Lee does that. So now I've got 2 messengers trying frantically to find me. You've got 2 armies of about 50,000 men, Meade on the east, Sheridan to the west of Lee's 12,500 or so at Appomattox Court House. Now, those two armies have got Lee in a vice grip. They're all looking at Lee, and Lee's remnants of the Army of Northern Virginia are looking both ways at them. And their attitude was, Yank, if you want some more of this, you come right ahead. We will give you all you wish to have. And of course, it would have been a bloodbath. More time passes. Lee again raises the concern that we need to get word to General Grant. He wrote another message, yet a third message, now to me the morning of the night. And he said, in essence, we need to talk. We need to have a cessation of activities. I want to surrender. See, most people don't know that Lee had sent me actually 3 messages the morning of the night. So then he sends a courier under federal escort looking for me. So now I've got 3 armies looking for me. Lee's army, Meade's army, Sheridan's army are all frantically trying to find me. An officer from Meade's Army of the Potomac rides out to meet Lee and says, General, could you remove yourself, please, sir, from this location because we've got to attack very shortly and we want you to be removed from harm's way. Now, that can be believed, and I applaud that. That actually happened. And General Lee says, I'm waiting to hear from General Grant. We're hoping to have a ceasefire. Then a little while later, this officer again rode out and pleaded with General Lee. And he said, very shortly, I've got to attack, and I do not want you here, General. I'm concerned about your well-being. And Lee said, well, hopefully we can get word from Grant. Well, at 11:50, I had Major Harry Pease come thundering up to me and my party, yelling and huzzahing, hurrahing, and shouting. And he said, I have a message from General Lee for you, General. I got it. I read it. I gave it to Rawlins and asked him to read it. He did. I asked him, will that do, General? And he said, yes, that will do. And I said, would you read it to the troops? And Rawlins tried to read it, but he broke down in tears. So he gave it back to me, and I read it. And it was the statement that General Lee said, I had come to meet you. You're not here. I want to meet with you for the purposes of surrendering the Army of Northern Virginia. I got off my horse and sat on a rock, and I wrote, yours of this morning at approximately 9 a.m. is just received by me this minute at 11:50 a.m. I gave a specific time. I am 4 miles west of Walker's Church. I gave the specific, as specific a location as I could give. And I will proceed to Appomattox Court House, and I will meet you at a time and place of your choosing. I did 3 things there. First of all, I gave the specific time because I knew when I read that note that what had happened, and I didn't want to have ever any, well, Grant's laid up drunk somewhere, Grant's laid out drunk somewhere. I wanted to say where I was when I got it because I wanted people to know exactly where I was to dispel any talk. I also extended an extreme courtesy. Now I'm the general taking the surrender, and I told the man surrendering, I gave him deference and respect. I said, I will meet you where you please. I don't know if that's to be found anywhere in military history. I had a decision to make. Now, this answers the question of why I was dressed. This is the second half. I've already told you my circumstances. I had to make a decision. Now, my van was somewhere unknown. I could send out couriers and tell them to locate my van, bring me a uniform appropriate for the occasion. But who knows how long that would take. Perhaps a day into the next day. I knew that there were 100,000 federal soldiers with 12,500 Confederate soldiers dead in the middle of it. And I knew that when you've got nearly 130,000 men, all armed, that there can be an accident. Somebody can have a misfire. Someone could drop a weapon. Somebody could have an accidental discharge. somebody could get too nervous and fire at somebody on the other side, and all it would take would be one shot, and the slaughter would be on. I was not about to waste any time over protocol and appropriate dress for the occasion. I wanted to stop the killing. So I made the decision that even though I was filthy, my hair was filthy and plastered to my head, I haven't bathed in several days, haven't even changed my underclothes in several days, that I had to get to Robert E. Lee as fast as I possibly could, if not sooner, and stop the killing. And that's why I was dressed as I was. Now, when I met General Lee, I noted that he had on a uniform. It was immaculate. I found out later it had never been worn. He had on a brand new uniform. He had a dazzling white shirt, and I marvel at how the man found something that white in this environment after so long in the field. His boots were highly polished, and he was carrying a jeweled presentation sword that was given him by the people of Virginia. I took no more note of my appearance. After the surrender, I noted he must have thought how I was dressed. Certainly not commensurate with him, but I had a reason for my appearance. It's been said I insulted him, that I wanted to demean him. That was not the case at all. I respect General Lee, and I would never have wronged him in that manner. So that's why I was dressed as I was. The surrender, we met. Was I nervous? No. I was a bit taken aback because I realized that when I stepped in that room, it was the first and the only time that the headquarters of the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac were ever in the same place at the same time. It was the only time when Lee come out to meet me that morning that he had ever appeared under a flag of truce. He wore a general's rank, the wreath around the stars on his collar. It was the only time that Robert E. Lee ever wore the rank of general. Never before and not after that meeting at Appomattox Court House. I made some small talk. Now, what were his feelings? I do not know. General Lee is an impassive man and has a stone face. I don't know how he felt. If he was relieved that the fighting and the killing were both over, or if he was sad because they had lost, or both. I do not know. I can't tell you his feelings. I've been asked, were you exultant? My reply to that is, at first I was. My migraine headache had disappeared the moment I read his note. But after the surrender ceremony, I was anything but exultant. I was anything but joyful. I was melancholic. I was sad for Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia because they'd lost. Now, I was not unmindful that the cause for which they fought was I felt, the worst cause that any country ever went to war to fight for. But being a soldier, I knew that it must have been gallingly bitter to have lost the fight for which they fought 4 years. So I was aware of how they must have felt. I was melancholy for them, and equal portions to being glad the killing was over. I made some small talk with General Lee, and after about 15 or 20, well, he told me he remembered me. He said, I remember having met you, but I don't remember the features of your face. And I said, well, two things. Well, I've grown a beard since then, and I didn't expect you to remember me from the one time that we met. It was during the Mexican War. I'd been out scouting all day. I brought a message to General Scott. Captain Lee at that time was, I believe, his chief of staff for General Scott. And he had forevermore dressed me down for coming in less than dress uniform, which General Scott required. And I told him I'd come straight from the field with important information. And Captain Lee required that I go back to quarters and put on a dress uniform, come back and meet with General Scott. So General Lee, when Captain, the only time he'd ever met me, had dressed me down for my poor appearance, and yet here I was again the second time we met, and I looked worse than I did the first time. Beginning to be a habit with me of sorts. But as I said, I thought no more of that until after the meeting. General Lee finally coughed and said we need to be about business, and we talked about the surrender. And I could say much, but I will not go into that. I will say that my surrender conditions were 5 sentences. I believe I wrote a total of 188 words. And General Lee wrote 3 sentences. I think he wrote 67 words. And essentially, the war was over. There were still 5 surrenders all the way through September. But once the word got out that Lee had surrendered, the other field armies pretty quickly put down their arms and stopped fighting. A couple of myths that I would like to dispel. First of all, General Lee did not offer me his sword, and I declined it. The sword was never mentioned. I specifically avoided even looking at his sword because the other condition being that I allowed officers to keep their sidearms. Now, of the several things that I said and did not say in those 5 sentences, which is another topic for another talk, because there is much I said and much I did not say, but other things that I did not say. I took a lot of criticism, scathing criticism, because I allowed the Confederate officers to keep their sidearms. You're going to let a bunch of Rebs loose in the countryside. They're going to be killing the side. And my steadfast reply was and is, no, that's not a concern. They are all honorable men. And if they say they're not going to fight anymore, which they have, they won't. And let them keep their sidearms. But my purpose was that an officer's sidearms are twofold: his pistol and his sword. The sword being a symbol of authority. And I let them keep their sidearms because I did not want to add insult to already grievous injury, requiring the defeated Confederate officers to surrender their swords to the conquering Yankee foe. Let them keep their pride. I knew that there would be thousands of mantles across the South with swords and sabers proudly hung over the fireplace. But that mattered not to me. Let them keep their pride. And that's one of several ways that the healing began in the McLean parlor, by letting them keep their swords and not having to surrender the symbol of their authority to the conquering Yankee foe for him to break it over his knee. That's why I let them keep their sidearms. General Lee said that for letting them keep their sidearms and personal baggage, their horses and mules, would have a most happy effect on the Army. And another myth that I wanted to dispel, the first one being that I asked for his sword. The other myth is that we countersigned our statements. We did not. I wrote the 5-sentence conditions of surrender, and he wrote the 3 sentences acceptance. And he kept a copy of the conditions. I kept a copy of the acceptance. And that the exchange was all we did. There's no counter signature at all. In fact, I understand that General Lee's family, the home at Stratford Hall, has the original of my surrender conditions. In fact, they do. It didn't go anywhere but General Lee and to his ancestral home at Stratford Hall, and that's where my conditions of surrender are at this moment. Colonel Ely Parker wrote out 3 copies. I think he might have wrote a 4th and kept a copy for himself, but I didn't ask him. I said, if that's what you'd like to do, you may keep a copy. And after 75 minutes, General Lee took his leave of me, walked out of the room. I followed him out. My staff followed me out. There were about 15, 16 men who were in the room, not all at one time. They rotated in and out. There were never more than 5 or 6 men in the room with me at any one time. General Lee had Colonel Marshall with him. I had Ely Parker with me the whole time, my secretary, and Ted Bowers, Colonel Theodore Bowers. And the other 3 or 4 men would cycle in and out. When I walked out the door behind General Lee, they all followed me out. The rest of the officers with me were on the front porch of the McLean house. And
By this time, all around the McLean House, there were hundreds to thousands of Federal soldiers that had gathered. General Lee had his horse brought around. Private Joshua Johns was his private with his horse. He and Colonel Marshall waited for travel to be brought about. The only emotion he ever displayed was he snapped his right fist into his left hand absent-mindedly 3 times as he was waiting for Traveler. He mounted Traveler. He turned to face me. I saluted. He returned the salute, and I lifted my hat to him, as did my staff behind me. General Lee lifted his hat, replaced it upon his head, turned Traveler about, and rode back out the gate to his right, went back to the encampment of the Army of Northern Virginia. And it was over.
Well, thank you very much, General. I enjoyed the conversation, reminiscing about the past. Probably not always easy to do, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity for me to talk about it, and perhaps others may learn a bit. I should hope they do.
Thank you, General.
You're welcome.
I would like to thank my guest, historian and Ulysses S. Grant interpreter, Dr. Curt Fields. He truly brings the famous American general to life. Our featured brew was Lucky 25 American Brown from the Trapezium Brewing Company of Petersburg, Virginia. If you liked our talk today, please share the episode with a friend. And remember, as I mentioned earlier, to subscribe to the podcast. All you have to do is hit the subscribe button on the directory that you use and get those new shows right away. For more information on the podcast, like the History A Go-Go Facebook page and check out our YouTube channel as well. The music was provided by the North Carolina band Bones Fork. And if you want to know what they have going on, and they do have new stuff coming out soon, just click on the link in the description below. To our growing list of listeners and supporters from several countries and hundreds of cities across America, I have to say once again, thank you. There are many more great episodes on the way, with discussions on the stories of the unexpected and slightly odd and strangely wonderful in art history, the Shawnee Chief Tecumseh, the Greedy Queen, and Greek poems and the gods. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.
Yes, we'll rally round the flag, boys, we'll rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. We will rally from the hillside, we'll gather from the plain, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah. Down with the traitor and up with the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom.